prosperity a product of regionalism? And secondly, is the fact that when we talk about regionalism, we have seen dramatic growth in the number of regional organizations since 1945. But all the same, we also see the strengthening of international global institutions like the United Nations, which was also created in 1945. So on the one hand, we have the United Nations system, which comprises of the UN as well as its agencies and other related or non-related agencies like the WTO, World Trade Organizations, and at another level we have regional organizations operating at the regional level. Now the issue here is the relationship complementary or contradictory? Does the creation of regional organizations contradict or complement the United Nations? This is something that we have to think about whilst I lecture. You have to think about. Secondly is the issue of globalization. When we talk about globalization, what do we mean by globalization? How do we define globalization? What is globalization all about? And what are the merits and demerits of globalization? These are some of the issues that we need to look at. Now, a lot of people use the word globalization without even understanding what globalization is in the first place all about. The third, when we talk about regionalism, we need to know the definition of regionalism. Now, more importantly, we need to know what is today known as community building. In many parts of the world, particularly in Europe, in ASEAN, Southeast Asia, even to some extent in Africa and in South Asia, we always see politicians, policymakers using the word community building. What do they mean by community building? And what is often used alongside community building is the creation of security communities. Are security communities very much alike military alliances or not? The next point relates to interregionalism. Now, we have seen a dramatic increase in the number of regional organizations. All the same, we also see a lot of inter-regional integration. Regional organizations today are reaching out to a variety of actors across other regions. Like, for example, the ASEM, the Asia-Europe meeting. Okay. Now, ASEAN itself has become a platform for many forms of inter-regionalism. For example, ASEAN's dialogue partners, ASEAN +3 and the like. Last but not least is when we talk about regionalism, we need to understand that there are levels of regionalism. There are many levels or phases of regionalism. We have got sub-regionalism. We have also micro-regionalism. We also have extra-regionalism. I have given you the example of extra-regionalism under the point inter-regionalism. Now, what is sub-regional and what is micro-regional? Sub-regional are when a number of states in a particular region get together, not all, number of states get together to undertake activities collectively. What about micro? Now, micro might not involve states. It might just involve national sub-state actors. Like, for example, in the context of ASEAN, we have the SIJORIs, Singapore, Johor, Riau Growth Triangle. Now, the Singapore, Johor, Riau Growth Triangle involves a state and two sub-state actors. With that, let's move on slides. Now, this is how the world would look when we talk about regionalism. We find that states are organized in many layers of regionalism around. Now, this gives you a clearer picture. These are just some of the regional organizations that have been created. Some, of course, have taken the form of free trade areas like the NAFTA, even the Mercosur. Now, the Mercosur is a very good example of sub-regionalism. So is the SADC and even the IGAD and the ECOWAS. Why? Because despite the fact that we have the African Union, yet within the same continent we find states undertaking activities on a different lower platform. This, whilst the higher platform is always known as multilateralism, scholars today call this lower platform as mini-lateralism. So on the one hand we have multilateralism. On the other hand, we also have mini-lateralism. Now, this is how one Harvard scholar defines a region. He, quote unquote, Joseph Nye, he says that a region is a limited number of states linked by geographical relationship and by a degree of mutual interdependence. Now, these are the two keywords. Now, geographical relationship here does not necessarily mean geographical proximity. Yeah, does not mean, because how we define regions differs from one region to the other. For example, the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation defines the region being comprised of 8 countries, Pakistan and Afghanistan included. But the IMF's definition of but for the IMF, Pakistan and Afghanistan are listed as being part of the Middle East. So how organizations define regions differ from one entity to the other. And of course, when we talk about regions, who had defined these regions in the first place? For example, when we talk about Southeast Asia, in 1945, Southeast Asia included present-day Southeast Asia as well as Sri Lanka. But ASEAN today does not comprise of Sri Lanka. So geographical relationship here does not necessarily mean geographical proximity. Mutual interdependence, there is a sense of interdependence, there's a sense of shared similarities, shared visions and things like that. Now, the other definition which the same scholar gives is the formation of interstate associations. Now, this is very interesting because we find countries getting together to institutionalize their relations via intergovernmental organizations on the basis of regions. Today, we find a vast array of regional, sub-regional, and micro-regional arrangements throughout the world. This is regionalism, one of the definitions of regionalism by a scholar by the name of Haywood. Yeah, it's that he refines regionalism as a theory or practice of coordinating social, economic, and political activities within a geographical region comprising a number of states. On an institutional level, regionalism involves the growth of norms. Now, this is very important. Rules and formal structures through which coordination is brought about. Now, for example, we always talk about the ASEAN way. The ASEAN way is the normative approach by this regional organization. So it is ASEAN's norms that we are talking about when we talk about the ASEAN way. Of course, there are rules and there are formal structures. And especially when we talk about the ASEAN community, structures have become more visible today when compared with 1967 when ASEAN was first formed. It also implies, I continue, it also implies a realignment of political identities and loyalties from the state to the region, yes, where we find regional affiliation, now the sense of regional affiliation now growing stronger. And we find that states now define their interests in terms of the region rather than in terms of national boundaries alone. Now, this is very, very interesting again. For example, in the Malaysian case, the foreign policy of Malaysia saw a paradigm shift under the second Prime Minister Tun Razak, who began identifying Malaysia's interests closer to the region rather than to the world at large. The last point, the extent of regional integration may range from cooperation among sovereign states on the basis of intergovernmentalism to the transfer of authority from states to central decision-making bodies in accordance with supranationalism. Now, if we take the case of EU, there is some degree of supranationalism here. Why? Because in the case of the EU, we find some transfer of authority, limited though, transfer authority from the national governments to the EU authority in Brussels. Like, for example, the common defense and foreign and security policies of the European Union are very good examples. The Eurozone is another good example of the transfer of authority from the state to a central decision-making. But on the other hand, when we look at ASEAN, for example, we don't find this transfer of authority to a central decision-making body. Why? Again, this varies depending on the degree of integration at the regional level. Now, Europe, by and large, is a fairly highly integrated region when compared to the other regions of the world. Now, the rise of new regionalism and interregionalism. Now, this is one phenomena scholars have been talking about, how globalization has brought about the rise of new regionalism. Now, first and foremost, we have to understand what is new regionalism and what is old regionalism. I will deal with that shortly. Now, there are also scholars who have argued that in the face of globalization or heightened pace of globalization, regionalism has become the bulwark, has become the bastion of reducing pressures that arise from globalization. Now, as we all know, globalization has its merits and demerits. One way to mitigate the demerits is to regionalize. This is what some regions actually do. ASEAN, again, is a very good example, especially if you go through the ASEAN Community Blueprint and especially the ASEAN Economic Community Blueprint. Next point, a new regionalism is emerging along with new forms of interregionalism. I think I have explained that earlier, how today regions are today looking beyond their own region and are connecting other regions of the world via trade, political relations, socio-cultural relations, and the like. Now, this table shows you what is old regionalism and what is new regionalism. Now, basically, when we talk about old regionalism, we are talking about regionalism that existed from about 1945 till about 1991 or during the Cold War years, whilst new regionalism is one that that has existed since the end of the Cold War, particularly since after 1991. Now, one of the underlying difference is all regionalism was often imposed from the outside. It was a design brought by powers from the outside into regions. Like, for example, the formation of North Atlantic Treaty Organization or NATO in 1949. NATO is and remains a military alliance. Now, NATO was a design imposed by the Americans from the outside to Western Europe. Now, in new regionalism, the logic or the initiative is developing from within. So, the first underlying difference is, one is the initiative is coming from the outside. For new regionalism, the initiative is coming from inside. Now, if we look at ASEAN, for example, whilst ASEAN was not really imposed from outside, but the fact of the matter is ASEAN was to a large extent a reaction to events outside the region as well. So the extra regional pressures were there. But when we look at the ASEAN community, we can see the logic of how it is developing today is very much different. How ASEAN now tries to enhance integration and things like that. The second point, old regionalism was introverted and protectionist. Yes, very, very protectionist, particularly when we look at the EEC, the European Steel and Coal Union, which was later transformed into the European Economic Community and eventually into the European Union. Fairly introverted and fairly protectionist. Today, most regional designs are extroverted and linked with globalization. So basically, most regional designs are very outward looking rather than inward looking. The third point is, in old regionalism, regional organizations had specific and very narrow objectives, and these were namely trade or even security issues. Whereas today, you find that new regional designs are more comprehensive and have multidimensional objectives, which includes economics, politics, security, culture, and the like. The fourth point, in terms of membership, old regionalism was very, very exclusive. whilst today it's very inclusive and open. Now we take ASEAN for example. ASEAN was formed in 1967, and until 1990, 1991, ASEAN was comprised of non-communist countries. It's only after 1991 that ASEAN began opening up to the countries in Indochina. So ASEAN only started becoming inclusive and open after 1990. Now this again is new regionalism. The next point is old regionalism was a European phenomena, model on European communities. Yes, to a large extent, the idea of regionalization, the idea of regional groupings existed from Europe, but it is not quite true to say that it's largely European, because the first regional organization that was formed in the 19th century was in the Western Hemisphere. The Organization of American States predates as the oldest regional organization in the world. Today, regional organizations are very much worldwide phenomena and very much a heterogeneous phenomena. The last point, all regionalism represented basically states and was state dominated, and it functioned very much as IGOs, intergovernmental. It was a G to G, government to government kind of relationship. But today, present day regional designs today involve much more a bigger audience. It involves not just states, but it also involves actors in the market, particularly transnational corporations, the business community, civil society actors, and things like that. So today we are not just talking about track 1 diplomacy, we're talking about all sorts of diplomatic interaction, track 2, track 3 until track 9. Track 1 is normally G to G, the other tracks are non-G to G. So today, when we look at the European Union, whilst is to some extent concentrated, where authority is concentrated in Brussels, yet when we take a look closer, we find there's a lot of interaction among civil society groups, amongst the corporate sector and the like, the business actors and the like. Now, why are regional organizations formed? Why do countries in a particular region create regional organizations? These are some of the reasons that I have highlighted. One is political reasons. There is always political expediency for the creation of regional organizations. Now, every regional organization will have an underlying political reason, although it may be implicit rather than explicit. For example, whilst ASEAN's declared intentions were to enhance regional cooperation in the area of economics and culture, the real reason was actually the Cold War. So when we look at the formation of regional organizations, we have to look at both implicit and explicit reasons. So political reasons are always there. Now, let me take our attention to the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, the SAARC. The stated aim of the SAARC is to enhance regional cooperation amongst the 7 or 8 states of South Asia. But the real reason for the formation of this organization in 1985 is still very much related to Indo-Pakistani rivalry. Economic reasons, yeah, these are always the stated aims of most regional organizations, and the key to this is always to enhance economic cooperation, to allow for deeper integration, free flow of goods, services, and the like. And of course, last but not least, is the cultural or political dimension. The cultural dimension to forge a common identity. Now, the reality of most regions, minus perhaps Europe, is that most regions are extremely diverse. And yet we find regional organizations talking about a regional identity. This sometimes appears to be something that does not really reflect the reality on the ground. For example, when we talk about Southeast Asia, what really is Southeast Asian identity? So what you find ASEAN today trying to do is to actually create a Southeast Asian identity. Of course, it will take a very, very long time. Now, there are other regions there probably the issue of identity is more visible when compared to other some other regions of the world. The issue of regional identity is probably more visible in the case of the African Union, or even in the case of the organizations in Latin America, where most countries at least share one common denominator, that is Spanish is widely used as the lingua franca in this southern hemisphere. All the same, when we look at other regions, for example, Southeast Asia comes to my mind. Again, Southeast Asia is a region of diversity. So the creation of a regional identity can also be used as a starting point or a building point towards community development. Now, these are some of the reasons and outcomes for the creation of regional organizations. One, first, of course, under economic reason, it promotes trade. It promotes trade. The whole idea of regional organization is to enhance inter and intra-regional trade. Now, in the case of ASEAN, most of our trading partners are extra-regional powers. China currently is the largest trading partner with most Southeast Asian states. But when we look at the level of intra-regional trade within the ASEAN region, we find that it's rather insignificant, although over the years it has been growing. Now, promotion of trade obviously also promotes greater economic integration, greater sense of interdependency amongst the countries. The second point, going back to the first point, one of the characteristics of most regional designs are, in fact, the creation of free trade areas. We find the existence of free trade areas practically in every part of the world, and this is something that has become a feature of regional organizations, particularly in the post-Cold War era. Most regions are trying very hard to liberalize inter and intra-regional trade, basically to enhance trading activities amongst members and also with members outside the region. Second brings about standardization of practices. Now, regional entities are formed to enhance regional activity, and regional activity can only be enhanced or increased if there are standardization of practices, particularly when it comes to practices in border management, border control, custom and excise duties, and the like. So when regional organizations are created, one of the areas that you always see a high level of activity is the standardization practices. And we are actually, we saw that in Europe. We have been seeing that in Europe for the last more than 20 years, but we are currently seeing greater efforts being undertaken within the context of ASEAN. And the third is, of course, economic integration, very much again related to not just trade, but intra-regional investments, intra-regional flow of goods, services, and to some goods, services, including financial services, and to some extent, labor. To some extent labor. Why do I say to some extent labor? Generally speaking, even when we look at the global economic regime, we don't really find the free flow of labor. Even within the case of ASEAN, there are provisions for the a fairly free flow of professionals rather than labor. This again is an area that is always a sensitive area. Four, it promotes stability. Many countries rush or go into regional designs for the simple reason that they wish to ensure that they can contribute to regional stability. The AEC was one good example, although it was explicitly aimed at enhancing economic activity, but the whole reason for the creation of the AEC was actually to work as a bulwark against communism or communism in Eastern Europe. So this is how regional organizations can play a role in promoting stability. Again, ASEAN comes to my mind, how ASEAN managed to stay united, or the 5 original members managed to stay united and ensure that ASEAN remains free of foreign interference. And it is within this concept that we see ASEAN's several of ASEAN's declaration, namely the Zone of Peace, Freedom and Neutrality, or SOCFUN declaration. Similarly, role of norms. So when we talk about stability, we are also talking about stability within the region and stability or protecting the region from sources of instability from outside the region. That is basically how can countries in the particular region mitigate major power rivalry. How can they manage major power rivalry in a particular region? And again, you can see that in the case of ASEAN. The 5, when we go back to the creation of Organization of American States, OAS, the African Union, and to some extent even SAARC as well as ASEAN, the implicit reason for the creation of regional organization relates to attempts by smaller states to check or to counterweigh and counterbalance a regional hegemon. In the case of the Western Hemisphere, the regional hegemon that we talk about is United States of America. In the case of EU, of course, in the case of African Union, of course, these are the larger states like Nigeria, Egypt, and the like. And in the case of SAARC, it's India, Pakistan. And in the case of Southeast Asia, when I say Southeast Asia, I'm talking about the 5 original members. It is Indonesia. Now, the formation of ASEAN implicitly was very much related to the fact that the 4 other states had to deal with Indonesia. And one of the methods of dealing with Indonesia was via institutionalizing regional relations. And this is one reason why ASEAN was created. Yeah? The key question was, how do we manage Indonesia? You must always understand that Indonesia under Sukarno had, to some degree, some hegemonic ambitions like the Greater Indonesia scheme and things like that. Now, this was one of the main concerns of Thailand, Malaysia, and even Singapore. And the last but not least is to manage extra-regional powers. Basically, again, we see in the case of Southeast Asia, how ASEAN has managed major power rivalry in the region. During the Cold War, of course, it was rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, and to some extent, Communist China. But today, when we talk about rivalry, we are talking about 2 different views. First, the first view argues a rivalry is between United States and China, a rising China. Of course, there is another view that today we have seen the entry of multiple major powers into the region. Today we find not just China and India competing for influence in Southeast Asia, we also find other powers in the region. For example, India via its Act East policy, Japan in the region and the like. So basically these are the 2 views, but what is significantly discussed most of the time is United States-Chinese rivalry in the region. Now, this is an example of a regional organization that was created, one of the ones that was created very, very early, particularly in the 1880s. It was actually started as the Pan-American Conference or the International Conference of American States, and eventually it was institutionalized in 1948. Yeah? The OS, as the name they use it today, was created officially in 1948, although a loose form of regional institutionalization had already existed in the 1880s. Now, why was this formed in the first place? This was basically an initiative by the Latin American states to manage American hegemony in the region. Now, why was it institutionalized in 1948? Institutionalization and in 1948 and it being headquartered in Washington DC allowed greater control by Washington DC over the organization. So today we find the Americans sort of playing a quote unquote a big brother role in the OS. This is the organization in the Western Hemisphere. The Benelux Union. Now, this is a good example of a union created to standardize practices. To standardize practices, it was actually established as a customs union in 1944, and it was basically aimed at promoting trade between Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. Although it only came into force in 1947. It's a politico-economic union. I mean, we don't really hear much of it, but we actually see a lot of trade going on between these three particular countries. And of course, in 1999, a nominal Benelux parliament was also created. Now, the parliament basically standardizes national policies. Now, this is a union like this, theoretically, is normally referred to as a functional organization. The Nordic Council, now the Nordic Council is another, now like the Benelux Union, the Nordic Council is another example of mini-lateralism, not just multi, but mini-lateralism. It's basically a geopolitical parliamentary forum created in 52 by 5 Nordic states, namely Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden, that are full members. And of course, you also have associated members, the Åland region of Finland, the Faroe Islands and Greenland in Denmark. These are the associated members. And you also find other Baltic states, particularly Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, as observer members. Now, the whole idea of this council was to enhance trade, to standardize practices, to encourage a common labor market and free movement of goods, services, goods in trade and services amongst across borders. Yeah, very much a functional kind of organization. Now, this again, this was a bigger scheme, the European Steel and Coal Union, formed in 1951 via the Treaty of Paris by Belgium, France, West Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. It was considered the first supranational organization. It had authority to some extent to standardize practices amongst member countries. Now, one of the major aims of stated aims of this organization was basically to standardize and to stabilize the steel and coal union as the global market. At that point in time, there was a lot of competition in the steel and coal market, but what this organization was attempting to do is to ensure stability in the production of steel and coal. And did they manage to do it? Yes, they managed to do it very successfully. That was the economic underlying reason. But of course, the political reason was this was actually a design to unite in the face of the threat of communism. Now, it was proposed by Schuman, the French foreign minister, on 9 May 1950, where he openly declared that the idea was to make war not only unthinkable but materially impossible. Now, the genesis of the European Union begins from this union, this organization here. And today, yes, whilst in both World War I and World War II, we saw the Germans attacking the French. Would it be possible today to see such a scenario? I would say extremely remote. Why? Today, the level of integration is much higher, so much so that both the Germans and the French are dependent on each other when compared with 70, 80 years ago. Okay, that I have explained the last point. DEC to the EU. Now, from the European Steel Coal Union in 57, the same countries created the European Economic Community via the Treaty of Rome, again to take economic integration to greater heights. Yeah? And in 1993, it eventually resulted in the formation of the European Union through the Maastricht Treaty. And of course, when we talk about the European Union, we're also talking about the European Parliament in Brussels. We're also talking about the Eurozone, countries that use a standardized currency known as the euro. So these are the developments that have taken place in just Europe. What started in Western Europe during the Cold War years is today fully European phenomena, particularly due to enlargement of the EU. Okay, and it is due to this enlargement that we find integration growing amongst these members, so much so that today it's a highly integrated region. Okay, we continue. This is the timeline of the European Union. Yeah, 1945 is when World War II ended, and it's important because World War II left devastating consequences on the European continent, because war actually started in Europe first, and then of course in the Asia Pacific. And it must be remembered that the Europeans had, in the 20th century alone, fought two major wars. So this is why the end of the Cold War marks a beginning of a new era. And of course, in 1959, via the Treaty of Paris, we saw the creation of the ECFC. And further to this, in 1957, via the Treaty of Rome, we saw the creation of the EEC, or a single market, which is what ASEAN is talking about now, which Europe had started in 1957. In 1992, the Maastricht Treaty, the European Union, was created, and a single market was completed. And by 2002, the euro, the standardized currency, was introduced. So this is a process of integration in Europe. This is the timeline of ASEAN. These are some of the major milestones. 67, the creation. 76 was the first ASEAN summit in Bali, institutionalization. 78, ASEAN European Economic Community Ministerial Meeting, extra-regional or inter-regionalism was started by ASEAN. 84, Brunei joins. 94, ARF was created, ASEAN Regional ASEAN Regional Forum, which is an offshoot of the ASEAN process. And then 1995, we saw Vietnam joining, 97 Laos and Myanmar, and of course in 1999 Cambodia, yeah, and in 2000 2005 the first meeting of APT, or ASEAN Plus ASEAN Plus 6 was held. And this eventually led to the signing of the ASEAN Charter in 2007. Now, if you look at the process after 2005, you see that the process is being, you see greater institutionalization within this regional organization. And then you also have the FTA with Australia and New Zealand in 2009. And since the 1976 summit, we have annual summits. Now, chairmanship rotates in an alphabetical order via these member states and things like that. But of course, the most important vision of ASEAN is what we agreed on in 2015, that is the ASEAN community. Now, the ASEAN community has three pillars: the economic community, the socio-cultural community, and last but not least, this political security community. These are the three major pillars of the ASEAN community. Basically, the entire community project focuses on how the region would undertake efforts to enhance regional as well as extra-regional integration. And one of the key features of the ASEAN community is to create an outward-looking region and the creation of a single product. This is how ASEAN cooperates throughout the world. ASEAN is basically linked with countries, many regions. Today we have ASEAN dialogue partners like India, United States, Russia. We also have ASEAN plus 10 ASEAN members, as well as China, South Korea and Japan. We also have the East Asia Summit, which is again an offshoot of ASEAN. So when we talk about multilateralism within the ASEAN framework, we are talking about how ASEAN interacts in many levels and many forms and things like that. And of course, not to mention the ASEAN Regional Forum that annually meets to discuss issues pertaining to defense and security across the Asia Pacific. Now, next we reach to the SAARC, the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, that was formed in 1985. The original members were Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan and Sri Lanka. In 2005, Afghanistan joined this organization. The observer members are Australia, China, EU, Iran, Japan, Mauritius, Myanmar, South Korea and the US. Russia and Turkey has applied for observer member status as well. Now, basically, the organization's implicit reasons, formation implicitly was formed to actually mitigate Indo-Pakistani rivalry. But of course, explicitly it was to undertake functional cooperation. Now, when we talk about functional cooperation, despite the fact that Indo-Pak rivalry is an overwhelming phenomena in the region, we find a lot of functional cooperation being undertaken by countries at the regional level. Cooperation in agriculture and meteorology, in education, in management of waters from the major rivers that flows through a number of countries, creation of early warning systems on natural disasters. So this is the origin of the SAARC. Yeah? I have already stated that. Interestingly, the 11 areas of cooperation are agriculture, education, culture and sports, health, population and child welfare, the environment and meteorology, rural development, including the SAARC youth tourism, transport, science and technology and communication. This is where you find a lot of cooperation going on, efforts at greater connectivity and things like that. This is again a little bit on the history of SAARC. I won't go into the details of it. Suffice is it for me to say that Bangladesh and Nepal played a very important role in the creation of the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation. In fact, these two countries were the main key partners that started a process of trying to persuade the two rivals, India and Pakistan, to agree to come into a regional organization. These are the objectives. You can go to the website of the SAARC and look at the objectives. Very noble objectives. Now, these are regional institutions in the Asia-Pacific region. Just in Asia-Pacific, you have got the ASEAN-Europe process with the European Union. You have got ASEAN, ASEAN plus 3. Now, you see, you look at ASEAN here is in yellow. This clearly shows ASEAN's centrality. And you also have got the Pacific Forum, Pacific Island Forum, the APAC, the SAARC, the CAREC. So this is how ASEAN undertakes regional cooperation with extra regional partners and things. Now, just a little bit on ASEAN plus 3, which is ASEAN China, ASEAN Japan, ASEAN South Korea, and not forgetting ASEAN India. Yeah? And of course, down there you also have ASEAN CER, that is basically ASEAN's relations with Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands. Now, when we look at economic activity in this region, you find that economic activity in this region is very, very high. And this is one of the reasons why ASEAN has always been an attraction to many major powers from outside. Why? We are talking about a market that is close to about 600 million people yeah, a huge market, and a market with a great potential. Now, stages in economic regionalism. Now, this is something that all of you will have to remember. These are the stages countries go through towards the creation of towards the creation of economic regionalism. The first is, of course, when the state is not does not undertake any initiatives, that is independent economy, an economy that is not in any way connected to its neighbors or something like that. And then, of course, the first step is always the preferential trade area, when states provide trading concessions, most favored nation status to neighboring countries and things like that. The second stage goes to the creation of a free trade area, where states enter into free trade arrangements specific to a number of items, to encourage the free flow of certain number of items, though limited, but basically to encourage. Like, for example, free flow of, say, rice in Southeast Asia. Of course, that is not the case, but just to give you all an example. As we go higher, it would mean a customs union. Customs union here would mean standardization of custom practice, custom and excise practices, especially when it comes to customs and excise duties to be standardized across the boundaries within the region. And the next step is, of course, the creation of a common market, which is what the EU did in when it created the EEC, European Economic Community. That was a common market. Do we have a common market in ASEAN? Not really at the moment. And of course, a monetary union. A monetary union here, again, EU 1992, I mean, sorry, not the Maastricht Treaty, but the introduction of the euro. The introduction of euro is the creation of a monetary union where a single currency is used. Is ASEAN anywhere near that? Again, not really. Fiscal union. Now, fiscal union would mean when countries mobilize financial resources to a centralized authority to ensure fair distribution of these financial resources, to ensure not just in terms of resources, but in terms of governance of financial institutions and things like that. And last but not least is a political union. Some countries do form political unions without even going through a lot of this. Like, for example, some people argue that to some extent the European Union is also a political union. But if we look at it closely, it is not really a union per se, because state sovereignty, or the issue of sovereignty, still rests with the state. The authority in Brussels is not considered a sovereign authority. Now, these are again another chart which would actually explain why countries go into regional designs. And if you look at the top, you have this idea of security community. The idea of security community is where there are two ways of it. Either you look at the creation of a community, or you look at it through the creation of alliances. So on the one hand, you can look at the EU. On the other hand, of the pyramid is actually the look at the NATO. How from competitive war fighting machineries, they go into military cooperation and integration and interoperable utilities. To some extent, that has not been realized as yet in the case of NATO. It hasn't been. But on the other hand of the spectrum, when it comes to the economic areas, you find chaos, countries competing, and then going towards a higher level of political and economic integration, and finally security community. Security community is not a military alliance. Security community is a region which is highly integrated, where the possibility of conflict becomes remote. The European Union is considered today a pluralistic security community. Their degree of integration is so high that the possibility of Germany and France going to war again is extremely remote. Why? Because of heightened integration, because of interdependence, or rather complex. This is a little bit on regionalization and globalization. Scholars have argued to answer back my first question that I posed to you, are they complementary or contradictory? They are complementary. Regionalization is part of globalization. This is something that has also been recognized by the IMF itself. Developing countries cannot escape globalization, should not try to avoid. This is what they were saying. But one way to mitigate the negative effects of globalization is to regionalize. These are some of the examples of FTA. This is only the tip of the iceberg. There are many more, hundreds of them around the world, ranging from bilateral free trade arrangements to minilateral and multilateral. Now, this little bit on theories of regionalism. The first phase of theorization very much focused on functionalism or neo-functionalism and intergovernmentalism. What they used to focus on is how regional organizations are created towards or are created aimed at enhancing functional cooperation at the functional level. The second wave of theorizing, on the other hand, is a wave that has been dominated by one school of thought in international relations, namely social constructivism. And social constructivists argue that the creation of a security community goes beyond economic integration. It's also the creation of a normative approach to international relations. Why? Because social constructivists always emphasize on the role of not just rules but norms as instruments that govern state. Now, these are some of the works you can read. I've given you just a few. I've also given all of you some readings on